Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and in today's video, we'll be doing a rogue guide for Subtlety for the patch or pre-patch. Subtlety is in an incredible spot right now, and most of you guys should at least give it a go. Trust me, even as someone who plays Outlaw all the time, and for me, prerogative would be to try to sell you guys Outlaw as best as I can, definitely give Sub-Rogues a try. This is probably the most fun you're going to have with Sub-Rogue in a long while, with respect to finally feel viable and good. I mean, it's an awesome experience. I'm going to go over everything you need to know for the pre-patch, give you guys the best talents you might want to try, and give you some of the more viable options, tell you what stats you might want to aim for. Of course, a lot of the details can be found from simming your character, but we'll go over some of the tips and tricks and hints in order to get you guys playing your sub-rogue and enjoying yourselves in dungeons as well as in raids. We'll start off with the fun bit. Let's get into the talents. I could start with the gear, I could start with the stats, but we'll just start talking about the talents. Most of the things that I'll break down in this video are going to be from an AoE Mythic Plus perspective, but also from raid perspective. So I'll usually first talk about the dungeon scenario, or actually rather let's do the raid scenario for any of you guys that want the best single target. And then afterwards we can talk about some of the counter options you can have in a dungeon scenario. First row of talents, there's actually a lot of good options between Weapon Master and Pre-Med. And then at some point in Shadowlands, Gloomblade will become really good. But I'm pretty sure you can do some cheesy things with Azurites to make Gloomblade better. Then it's going to be a choice of Night Stalker or Shadow Focus. In this row, Deepest Stratagem is generally going to be the go-to. Cheap Death is good. Night Terrors is fine, but if you need that CC chains or if you need cheap shots, which in most cases you shouldn't, but if you feel like you like to, you totally can run with either one of those. Envelopment Shadows right now is kind of like the bread and butter of the spec. You can play in some situations Dark Shadow, especially when an enemy is going to have a moment where they'll take a lot of damage. But Enveloped Shadows is just generally so good, even after some of its nerfs that have happened, it still is a very powerful combo having two dances for your sub-rogue. In the last row, it's Master Shadows and generally Secret Technique. So if you're going to be playing these talents, the current setup that I have for talents right now is going to play well with Azurites, it's going to play well with Essences, and is definitely the most optimal choice for pure single target. However, let's say you want to do some Mythic Plus dungeons. The talents I would recommend is going for Pre-Med to get free slices and dices, and sometimes in dungeons you are not always going to have slice and dice, Shadow Strikes available at all times. You will be using Shuriken Storm in order to generate the common points, and you'll lose out on the value Weapon Master can give you. So getting Shadow Strike in the opener, getting the free slice and dice, and then starting to generate common points with Shuriken Storm is just gonna work out fairly well. Plus, also you don't really ever need to refresh slice and dice. And then the last row would take Secret Technique, as it'll be your only real AoE finisher at the beginning of this expansion or pre-patch. Now, sub-rogues eventually do get an AoE finisher in form of Black Powder, but you're not going to get Black Powder until Shadowlands level 52. So right now, sub-rogues, weirdly enough, don't have an AoE finisher, but it sort of works itself out in some way or another. Sub-rogues have so much single target potential, and then you can also funnel common points into big eviscerates on the biggest target side of dungeons, or maybe on a boss inside of a raid, but it kind of works out. The spec just does really good damage right now, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. I feel like if you are, even if you're going to be mostly set for single target, you will find yourself generally doing quite a bit of damage as long as you follow this guide fairly closely. Alright, let's talk about talents. Let's talk about some of the stats and gearing. So some of the tips I have for gear for your sub-rogue. The best stats are going to be, I would say, versatility and critical strike. Critical strike gives you, well, more crits. If your abilities crit, you do more damage, but also it lets you maintain your find weakness buff. So Find Weakness became a passive going into Shadowlands instead of a talent, and you can proc from a variety of abilities. Cheap Shots and Shadow Strikes in the opener will bypass the enemy's armor, proccing Find Weakness 100%. But there'll be moments when you won't have Shadow Strikes, so having Backstabs just for that is the best choice, because Backstab behind the target, and if it crits, also apply Find Weakness. The idea for your sub-rogue is you want to have Find Weakness 100% of the time, and Critical Strike will end up scaling pretty well with you in general. Versatility is going to be good because we are not always going to be using Eviscerates. We do use our finishers, but we'll also be using a lot of Shadow Strikes. We'll be using Backstabs. We'll be auto-attacking the target quite a bit. So that's a lot of abilities that are going to be doing damage that are not part of your mastery. So versatility ends up being pretty good there. I would say afterwards Mastery is a decent stat, but so is Haste, because Haste will also give you extra attack speed, which with Slice and Dice you end up attacking quite quickly. And the energy regen you'll get out of it because of the passive called Shadowy Techniques. I mean, it just kind of works really well. I would still say Versatility and Critical Strike are your best stats. I would probably gem all Versa as much as you can. I would say Mastery and Haste would end up being your two lesser stats. But the most important stat is going to be Agility. Hell, Agility is so good right now for sub-rogues and other classes that you actually want Agility gems. So make sure you have at least one Agility gem, like in my bracers I have Leviathan's Eye of Agility, and in my gloves I have Kraken's Eye of Agility. In fact, most of my gear I'm actually using is same gear as Outlaw, because the secondary stats, or at least right now, are actually getting a little closer for all three specs, which is kind of cool. So as I'm not really someone who is playing sub as a main, my stats for Outlaw actually work out pretty well to do some competitive damage, even inside of Mythic Pluses, so it's quite interesting. For some of the trinkets, I would recommend something like a Spyglass. It's a generally good trinket, gives you a lot of agility, especially if you get it from the dungeon, gives you a lot of critical strike as well. Another trinket that I like playing with for sub in particular is Lystra's Golden Plumage, especially when you line it up together with the Shadow Blades in the opener. That's quite a lot of damage, and it lines up for the spec pretty well. There are some other trinkets that I will have sims for you guys to see, but it's best to sim your character to find out what are the best stats available for, or best trinkets available for you, and basically just pick the best trinket that you can find from your sims. For traits, we got a couple decent options. Now, my traits are by no measure are perfect, and some of the traits that I would recommend for you right now would be Triple Heart of Darkness. If you can get Triple Heart of Darkness, that's extra secondary stats of Mastery, Crit, Versatility, and Haste. Those stats are pretty good, and Heart of Darkness right now just procs without corruptions, so having triple of that with all raid gear is going to be a go-to. Some of the other traits to have one off are good is First Dance, maybe something like Inevitability, maybe something along the lines of Blade in the Shadows, but of course you can always sim your rogue. There are some playstyles and potential for like a triple First Dance playstyle, there's a potential for triple Inevitability playstyle, and if I can find this one more Azurite ability in my gear with Night's Vengeance, that still is a playstyle that's viable too. Now takes Night's Vengeance of BFA playstyle, replaces Nightblade with Rupture, and it plays very, very similarly. I haven't really got to play with this playstyle at all, but I've seen quite a lot of rogues on the logs when it comes to the raids using this, so it seems to be quite a decent option. Again, sim your rogue to find out what are the best traits, plug all of them available, and try to see if you can get yourself the best possible combination. Depending on your gear and how much gear you have, your combination might be different, but it seems that with sub-rogue, there's more than one way to skin a cat. Next thing is essences. Let's talk about those. So there's a couple different essences, and I can tell you which ones that the game recommended me from the Sims. So, simming our character, it turned out that Whirlwind Resonance ends up being quite good. Since primary stats are really good, and agility lines up really well for the sub-rogue dance playstyle, Whirlwind ends up being pretty well set up for the raiding, so in pure single target I would run that. In single target I will also run Memory of Lucid Dream, so then we are able to run a talent of Night Stalker instead of Shadow Focus. Then I would run Conflict with Strife because it's extra versatility and more damage. And then finally Crucible of Flame. For pure single target, that one is also pretty good. When it comes to AoE and Mythic Pluses, you actually have a couple options. Since sub-rogues don't really have a lot of AoE damage, and we are also capped on AoE, if you have a dungeon that has a lot of mobs in it, some of the essences for Major I would recommend is maybe Essence of the Focusing Iris, where you can just kind of blast all enemies in front of you after you 10 groups them up. But if your group is not going to be doing big pulls and rather wants to do smaller pulls, then something like Blood of the Enemy will end up being pretty good. Blood of the Enemy just works out really well for the big crit damage, and you can go for big eviscerates back to back into whatever target you choose. Blood of the Enemy can also be good for AoE as well, but it's just, I feel like it's a lot better where you can really max out the damage into that, I guess, pseudo AoE, somewhat single target playstyle that you get going on, just to be able to take care of the big guys in the groups much faster. But if your group is going to be doing a variety of different pulls, maybe a lot of small ones, or if it's a tyrannical week for Mythic Plus, I feel like you won't go wrong with Whirlwind Resonance. I mean, the problem with this one is it's positional, so if let's say you're in a dungeon where you have to move a lot, of course it's not going to be that good. But if you can find yourself good spots where you can plant your feet and get the max value out of Whirlwind Resonance, maybe your party members are also running it too, so then having this as a major might actually work out pretty well. Drop them down, do a bunch of damage every minute, and ends up being kind of consistent and will be really good for tyrannical bosses to get through them. I mean, you'll be just a power-hungry boss killer at that point. And that would be the essences, the gear, and the talents that I would run for Sub-Rogue. Now let's talk a bit about the rotation and some of the things you should be aware of. Now, I'm going to do a lot of my rotation showing you very slowly, so my damage numbers down below right here are not going to be optimal by any measure. I'm just going to kind of show you what the playstyle is going to be, what are some of the things you want to maintain. Sub-Rogue has a lot of things for you to kind of juggle, but not crazy to the point where it's spinning plates. It's a manageable amount of things to juggle, but a couple core things to remember. First of all, maintain Slice and Dice at all times. Slice and Dice is huge for you. That's a lot of auto attack, that's a lot of energy regen with a passive, that's a lot of common points with a passive. So maintain Slice and Dice as early as you can, establish it, and try to maintain full version of Slice and Dice. It also pandemics, so at 6 seconds you can actually press Slice and Dice again, and those 6 seconds will roll into a fresh, let's say 6 common points Slice and Dice, which is really cool. It'll give you like a really long duration of a Slice and Dice. Another ability you want to maintain at all times, especially on single target, is Rupture. Finish a move that tears open the target, dealing bleed damage over time, lasts longer per common point. In a Mythic Plus scenario, I would put up Rupture on as many targets as you can. Normally, with Shadowlands max level, you'll put it up on 3 targets, and then you would just press Black Powder from there. Unless you're popping really big cooldowns and bursting, then Black Powder every single press. This is basically like an AoE Eviscerate. It's awesome. But since we don't really have a lot of AoE as sub right now in pre-patch, I would say put Rupture on multiple enemies. And just keep throwing it on as many enemies as possible. Especially if they're going to last that long. Like if you think someone is going to survive 28 seconds worth of damage, put in a full Rupture on multiple enemies, since you can spread it and generate common points really quickly with Shuriken Storm. Might actually be value, but that's something for you to experiment, because you will want to be using secret techniques, and in some dungeons it might actually just be better to go for big eviscerates on a big guy. Let's say you go into I don't know, workshop or something, and you have that trash bag before the third boss where you have that one guy that will throw out squirrels, and you want to kind of nuke them down as soon as possible. It might actually be better for you to just funnel those common points to big eviscerates on that one target, take it out, make it easy for your party to get through, especially if you're climbing. But if you just want to pad and do damage evenly spread out, maybe trying to play against bowstring, then maybe putting Ruptures on multiple enemies and controlling your damage a little bit, slowing it down, but putting bleeds on everybody so everyone takes equal damage might end up being better. But that's a lot of things that you will have to make a decision of when playing your rogue. Alright, so let's talk a bit about the playstyle. So in the opener, you will open up on an enemy with Shadow Strike. You want to establish Slice and Dice as early as you can. And then the idea would be to pop every cooldown available. You will pop Shadow Dance, you will pop Shadow Blades, you would drop down World Vein, and you would use your Symbols of Death at the same time and start slamming Shadow Strikes into an enemy. So that would be the perfect setup for you right here. Just go for the most amount of damage. Just do as much damage as you can. Try to spend eviscerates at 4 or 5 common points if possible. You'll also, during this moment, will want to establish your Rupture. This is the perfect time since you generate a ton of common points. So just keep doing that as much as you can. Shadow striking and eviscerating as much as humanly possible. And that was your opener. Now you establish your Rupture, so you want to make sure that never falls off. So always maintain Rupture at all times. Also, never let your Slice and Dice fall off ever. And the thing that you want to do now next is use as many dances as possible to get those Shadow Strikes out. Another thing you want to do is keep Symbols of Death on cooldown. If you keep Symbols of Death on cooldown, this is a 30-second CD. Your World Vein is a minute-long CD. So you generally want those to line up every other time. So first time, World Vein and Symbols of Death gotta line up together. Next time, it'll be Symbols of Death by itself. Then 30 seconds later, Symbols of Death and World Vein together. Then 30 seconds later, it's Symbols of Death by itself. So that'll be kind of the play with those two abilities for single target. And while that's happening, you want to make sure you're getting as many Shadow Strikes as possible. But also make sure that you're only getting Shadow Strikes together with symbols. Or actually, every time you have symbols, you should have a Shadow Strike. If you want to burn a Shadow Strike before Symbols of Death, just to get some damage out, since you already have a charge of Shadow Dance, and just get a bunch of damage out, you can. Just try to make sure when you next time you use Symbols of Death, you also have Shadow Dance. So when we're going for big damage altogether, for everything being used all at once, just trying to maintain my dots, just trying to maintain my damage as best as I can. Need to get a Slice and Dice back up and running, so we'll use a Shadow Strike right here. So as for how often can you use Shadow Strike, or Shadow Dance rather, that's going to be a question for you to really answer, because it all depends if you're bloodlusting, it all depends if you're getting good procs, maybe you're getting a lot of energy very, very quickly. Let's say if you're about to overcap on Shadow Dances, then burn one. It'll be also all about how long the fight is going to be. So if, let's say, the fight isn't too long, and you feel like you can burn one more Shadow Dance right before the boss dies, you could just use Shadow Dance and just burn those Shadow Strikes in. If you think it's going to be a longer fight, maybe pacing yourself might be better. But again, it's going to be one of those things where you have to play the game, you have to play a character, you have to kind of get in tune with it. But yeah, that's going to be more or less the playstyle together with those abilities. And that's the sub-rogue playstyle. It's pretty simple on single target, and the thing about AoE doesn't really change too much. On AoE, you're just going to be using the abilities a little bit more frantically, I'd say. So the way that I adjust in AoE is you, of course, want to make sure that you got enemies dotted up. And you'll be switching around with AoE and going for a bunch of Shuriken Storms to build calm points. As always, I would say maintain Slice and Dice at all times, unless maybe you have way too many targets. And once we hit Shadowlands, when you have way too many targets, Black Powder will end up being better just to use all the time if, let's say, you're just capped. But Slice and Dice is something that should be maintained basically at all times. And the same rules apply to the way that you would burn abilities, like together with World Vein, together with Symbols of Death. You kind of want to use them together or almost on cooldown all the time. Although in dungeons, there is going to be desyncs. You'll be doing one trash pack, it'll pop in your cooldowns, and then you have to go to another trash pack, and there's a bit of a time gap in between. So trying to line up your Symbols of Death and other cooldowns together is going to be, again, a little bit of an art, a little bit of something that you will need to pick up yourself from running dungeons. Find out, okay, maybe I should save Symbols of Death or some cooldowns here for the next trash pack. Maybe, okay, this trash pack we're currently on needs to die. I better use the cooldowns. I will not need it for the next one. Maybe somebody else will have it covered. But it all depends if you're going to be doing like the really high keys, and the planning is going to be a lot more important. But then you probably have communication with the team, unless you end up doing pugging for everything. Yeah, it all depends kind of what kind of difficulty of content you're really going to be going for and striving for. Another thing is, since you don't have any AoE way of spreading your Find Weakness without Shuriken Storm rank 2, there is going to be a little bit of a question of, should you ever Shadow Strike an enemy, right? Is there potential, or is there a possibility, is there really a want to maybe go and put Shadow Strikes on a bunch of enemies? Would that be like super try hard? Should you do it either way? Because now that everybody has Shadow Strikes, everybody should take more damage, or now that everybody has Find Weakness, everyone should take more damage. Because in AoE, Shuriken Storm actually ends up doing quite a bit of damage when you have enemies stacked up, as long as you don't have over 8 targets. Shuriken Storm actually ends up doing quite good on damage, and it's just better to keep that pressed on cooldown as much as possible. But if you are going to be trying to cheese some enemies, some small trash back, and you want to put Find Weakness on everybody through Shadow Strikes, it's totally a viable option. But I just feel like it's not necessary. I guess it all depends on the big trash back. The best rule I can give you is maybe on 2 targets, 3 targets is totally doable. But on like 4, 5, and especially higher, I would just spam as many Shuriken Storms as you can, and then go on with your finishers. Maintain Slice and Dice, keep your Secret Technique on cooldown at all times, put some Ruptures out, and then Eviscerate. Find the biggest guy in that group and eviscerate the hell out of them. But that's going to be the more or less the rotational playstyle. There's definitely a lot of play in there involved. You have to kind of get playing your rogue and really get a feel for it. I feel like with single target, it's a lot more of an ideal, like, follow step-by-step playstyle of maintain these abilities on cooldown and try to sync them together. And that's what it comes down to. But in AoE, it changes a little bit, right? The way you would approach Workshop is a little bit different the way that you would approach Freehold or Underrot. Depending on the trash bag, there are some things you might learn here and there. But a lot of it, I think, can be picked up from regularly playing and trying these dungeons and trying with different groups. And not being afraid to experiment with things, especially if you're doing some lower end keys. Or if you're doing some keys with the guildies, even better place to experiment when they're perfectly fine with you doing some crazy and then wiping the whole group. But that's going to be just about everything you will need to know to at least get started with a pre-patch in Shadowlands. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I really do hope you guys enjoyed this Subtlety rogue guide for the pre-patch. I'm probably going to take some days and try to work on a Assassination rogue guide. I did already get some play on Assassination, but I really want to explore the spec more and learn more about it. But I hope you guys enjoyed these guides for the pre-patch. Definitely going to be making some Shadowlands releases. But it looks like we're going to be playing pre-patch for a while, so I wanted to give you guys something to hold you off until then. Thank you guys so much for watching. I do hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see all of you in another video.